Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture today with Professor Geraldine Gudefin, who will be exploring the Jewish diaspora and the evolution of Jewish identity. A special thank you to Nancy Siegel for generously sponsoring this program. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Spring 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. For more information on how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep your questions concise and in complete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Geraldine Gudefin is a French-born modern Jewish historian specializing in Jewish migration, family life, and legal pluralism. She holds an MA from Yale University and a PhD from Brandeis University. Her work has been published in American Jewish History and Nashim, a journal of Jewish women's studies and gender issues. She has received fellowships from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Posen Foundation, and the Center for Jewish History. Her earlier research examined Jewish marriage and family law in France and the United States. Now based in Southeast Asia, she is currently researching Jewish life in Singapore, which is actually where she's joining us from this evening, at least for us in the United States, Canada, and such. But it is early morning for her as we sit here. So one last thing before turning it over to Professor, I want to let you know that you'll have another chance to learn with her this September in a special 3-part series on her current research exploring Asian Jewish communities. So keep an eye out on your inbox, and more details will be coming soon after tonight's program. So with that, I now welcome Professor Gudefin to join us on the screen. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you might be. Unfortunately, I cannot see your names or faces, but I can see that there's a lot of people online, and I find this very, very heartening. So it's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. Also, I think I want to start by acknowledging that those are very difficult times for Jewish communities. You know, there was the attack recently in Washington, D.C. I imagine a lot of you are based in DC. The situation in Israel is also very concerning. So I think I can fairly presume that a lot of you are coming to this lecture with a lot of personal emotional stress and concern. And I hope that we can all find a little bit of respite and beauty for the next hour. So that's hopefully what I can provide. I think Jewish learning is something that can really strengthen us in moments like this. The other thing I wanted to really encourage you to echo what Matt said is to really ask questions in the Q&A. We will make time for this at the end, so I really hope to get to at least some of the questions. Before we really delve into the diasporic experiences of Jews, I have to say that when Matt suggested presenting this lecture in order to kind of launch the 3-part series on Jews in Asia, I felt so overwhelmed because covering so many centuries and geographic places where Jewish communities have lived over time is, of course, a very daunting task. So we're really going to scratch the surface. The main point of this lecture is for you to get really intrigued and excited about how much history and like diversity, cultural diversity is encapsulated by the Jewish historical experiences, or rather Jewish historical experiences in the plural. So I really hope that for a lot of you, this is just the starting point of a long journey. So I want to talk very briefly about my own journey with the topic, because as Matt mentioned, my expertise originally is in European and American Jewish history, and my work has focused particularly on Ashkenazi migration from Eastern Europe, particularly Russian Jews. And here I'm suggesting, especially in September, I'm suggesting to take you into Asia. So this is part of a different part of my history, which is my non-academic history, which is that about over 10 years ago, I served as a a JDC fellow, American Joint Distribution Committee fellow in India, and particularly in Bombay, in Maharashtra. And it opened a world that was completely unknown to me, which is the world of the B'nai Israel community of India, which is a very old community, possibly dating back to the commercial ties between ancient Israel and India. It's a community that over time developed very distinct traditions, and is very Indian, very embedded into local culture. And that really triggered my interest in this part of Jewish history. And then over a decade later, having a PhD in hand and 3 children in tow, my husband joined the State Department, and we ended up, after serving a few years in Tel Aviv, we ended up in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and now in Singapore. And I found myself actually following in the footsteps of Baghdadi Jewish communities, which were these communities of Jews. The name is a bit of a misnomer. Jews from Iraq and Syria who started migrating from the early 18th century on to the Indian subcontinent and formed a very rich network, trading and family network, spanning India, particularly Kolkata and Bombay. And then from there, they moved to Southeast Asia, places like Burma, Malaysia. So actually, there were Jews in the south part of Malaysia, in Penang, and Singapore. And it was really fascinating to me to really be in Singapore and see so much of what I had discovered about Jewish culture in India here. Because I mentioned the B'nai Israel community, which is the community in which I served in India. But in Bombay, there was another Jewish community, much more recent, which was the Baghdadi community. And if you go to India today, there's a number of synagogues that you can visit that were set up by those Baghdadi Jewish merchants. And so if you go to Singapore, you will find a very similar architecture, because the Jews that first settled in Singapore, when Singapore was started as a British entrepot in the early 19th century, were Jews originally from Baghdad, but who had come from the Indian subcontinent. So you can see all those ties across various geographic locales. So that's really where my interest is in. And as I start digging more into those very interesting and intriguing histories, I realized that in a place like the United States, which is predominantly Ashkenazi, so people know most of what they know about Judaism, they know from their own culture, right? From their family history, from their own migration history. And so I really realized that there is a need to kind of expand, especially in the United States, our understanding of Judaism, that one goes beyond just the Ashkenazi experience, but that also goes beyond the Ashkenazi Sephardic divide, because there's a tendency to collapse anything that's not Ashkenazi into the word Sephardic, which serves, it can serve political or other purposes, and I respect this, but I think it obscures the diversity and richness of past Jewish experiences, communal experiences. So with that in mind, the goal for today is to first give you a brief overview of historical migrations. I'm really going, it's going to be quite brief, hopefully, and it's going to go all the way until the late 1700s, which is when the Ashkenazi population in Eastern Europe became the main demographic group of world Jewry. So I'm not talking about more modern migration. I'm not talking about the exodus from Eastern Europe. I'm not talking about the Holocaust and post-Holocaust migration. I'm not talking about Jewish refugees from the Middle East, because one, we don't have that much time. And second, I think people are more familiar with those migrations. But again, if this is something you want to discuss at the end of the talk, you're welcome to put this in the Q&A. And once we've kind of covered that brief overview, and it's going to be a little bit overwhelming because there's a lot to cover, but once we've done this, I want to talk about 3 different aspects of Jewish culture that emphasize the main points that I want to make today. And the main point is the following: that wherever they lived, Jews have become embedded in local cultures. But at the same time, in most Jewish communities, that's not true of all. There are exceptions, and we can discuss this later. But in most places in the world, Jews, while being very embedded in local cultures, remain connected to a broader Jewish world and to other Jewish communities. So there's this really interesting dynamic interplay that you can see really throughout Jewish history between integration into the local culture and connection to something bigger, to other communities. And I wanted to show this through three different mediums, which are food, magic, so folk religion, and music. Okay, so we'll only scratch the surface, but I think it will give you a sense of how this dynamic has played out over time. Okay, so with that in mind, let's start with kind of this broad overview. So here I want to make three different points. The first one is that we usually associate Jewish migration with persecution, massacres, deportation, what Celebrant called the lachrymose version of Jewish history. And this is completely fair because we know that Jews over time migrated, among other reasons, for this very reason. But we see throughout history that voluntary migrations also played a big part in where Jews settled. And this is true already in the antiquity. Okay, this is not a recent phenomenon. So in the context of the exodus from Eastern Europe, in more recent history, historians have debated at great length why Eastern European Jews moved, and they have showed that though we associate migration with pogroms and persecution, in many cases, Jews moved primarily for economic reasons, not to downplay the role of violence, but what really triggered the final push was that the need to earn a living, right? So we see those dynamics going back a very long time in history. So that's the first point, and I will illustrate this. Sorry, I'm seeing from the chat, please consult. I don't know if this is connected to Matt. Sorry, can you? Okay. So voluntary migration. The second point is that they have always been main centers of Jewish life. So today, the main centers of Jewish life, of course, are Israel and the United States. But those centers have shifted over time. So I want to give you a little bit of sense of how those centers have shifted. And the third point is something that I just alluded to, which is that despite the scattering of Jewish community, the Jewish diaspora historically has largely been very connected. And we'll talk a little bit about what connected Jewish community across vast distances. So to go back, further away in time, the first deportation of the Israelites from the land of Israel was by the Assyrians in the late century of before the Common Era. And the Israelites were then deported to Mesopotamia, which would play a very large role in Jewish history. And this Mesopotamia, of course, is present-day Iraq. But really, what historians of Jewish migration typically see as the first diaspora is the one that occurred in the 6th century BC, which was, of course, the conquest of the kingdom of Judea, so the territory around Jerusalem, by the Babylonians in 587 BCE, and the destruction of the first temple a year later. And so already in the late 6th century before the Common Era, you have the exile of Jews to southern Iraq. And what's really interesting about this first diaspora is that Jews there, and again, we can talk maybe in the Q&A about the word Jew and the way we use it, but these exiles from Judea continue to identified as Yehudim. But what's really interesting is that 50 years after the exile, so in 538 BCE, when King Cyrus of Persia allowed those exiles to return to the land of Israel and to rebuild their temple, most of them chose to remain in Babylonia. So it's really interesting that, half a century in the grand scheme of things, it's not such a long time, but you can see already with this first diaspora that people found a home in Babylonia, built communal life, built culture there that they didn't want to leave behind, though they remained very connected in terms of identity and culture to the land of Israel. So I find this really fascinating because we see those dynamics playing out to this day, right? But this is a very old phenomenon. So really starting from that point on, so from the 6th century BCE, really to the 11th century of the Common Era, you see the flourishing of Jewish communities between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So in addition to those communities in what is now Iraq, in late antiquity, you also see the rise of communities, Jewish communities, under the influence of the Babylonian Empire and the Greek Hellenist culture and Roman civilization. So one of the main Jewish communities in late antiquity was actually based in Egypt. There were multiple communities in Egypt, but perhaps the main one was that of Alexandria. And here we go back to what I said earlier about the concept of voluntary migration, because Jews ended up in Alexandria, Egypt, after the city was built by the Greek conqueror Alexander the Greek, and they moved there because they found economic opportunities. They were not forced to move to Egypt. But there, especially in Alexandria, they built a very vibrant community where you see already kind of a fusion again, there's also rejection to some degree, but some sort of complex interplay between Jewish culture and Greek culture. And perhaps two examples of this are the fact that the Torah was translated into Greek in Egypt, the Septuagint, and that text actually later spread to the rest of the Mediterranean, and it had a very important impact on both Jewish and non-Jewish communities across the Mediterranean. And another example of it, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, are Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher and theologian who lived in the 1st century and wrote in Greek, and he was highly influenced by Greek philosophy. So you can really see how those influences played out already in the antiquity. So in the 1st century, before the destruction of the Second Temple, and usually I think most people associate the beginning of the Jewish diaspora with the year 700 of the Common Era, which was when the Romans destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, the Second Temple in Jerusalem. But what I'm trying to show here is that the Jewish diaspora existed way earlier than this. So already before the destruction of the Second Temple, you had 6 to 7 million Jews living in the diaspora, including 1 million Jews in Egypt and 1 million in what is today Iran, in ancient Iran. Okay, let's pause for a second. I realized I forgot to share my screen. I'm so sorry. So let me actually ask if anyone had questions now in the Q&A while I'm setting the PowerPoint up.
One note, I think you said the year 700, but I think you meant to say 70 for the
70, yes, absolutely.
for the destruction in case
Absolutely.
I might have misheard it, but
no, I might have misspoken. Of course, it's the year 70. Okay. Matt, can you see the PowerPoint?
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so to go back, actually, I'm so sorry, I forgot. I was so excited to share all this with you. So a brief interlude to show you some pictures I had prepared for you. So I made the point earlier that in the United States, usually when we think about Jews in the past, we have pictures of the shtetl that come to mind, East European Jews. And so I had wanted to actually start the lecture by showing you in pictures that in the early 20th centuries, there were Jewish communities that were in many other parts of the world, and that looked quite different from the ways that we imagine, Jews in Eastern Europe. So then we'll go back to the 1st century of the Common Era. So I had brought pictures from Tunisia in the beginning of the 20th century, a Jewish family in Iraq. So as you just heard from me, Jews have roots in Iraq starting a very long time ago in the 6th century BCE. Jews in Iran in the 1930s. And then Jews in Ethiopia. And here I'm not going to talk about Ethiopian Jews today, but I do want to note that communities, sorry, Matt?
I don't want to it seems like some people are seeing some boxes in front of your PowerPoint that are showing up. I don't know if you can
let me stop sharing and try again. So then leave it at this, and I hope everyone can see well enough. But really the whole point of this was to kind of change the way in which we imagine Jews in the past. And here I brought the picture of Jews from Ethiopia to show that Jews have also developed traditions and especially religious customs that don't necessarily have an equivalent in other Jewish communities. And this is the case with the Zigd festival of Ethiopian Jews. The next picture, Matt, if you can move on to that one, shows one of the last families, and actually calling them Jewish families is, I think, controversial, but one of the last families in Kaifeng, India, who identify as being descendants of Jews. And actually in one of the lectures I will present in September, we will talk about the Jewish experience in China and the decline of the Jewish communities and the ways in which some Chinese people today are reconnecting to this Jewish heritage. The next picture is a picture I actually took over a decade ago when I was posted in India for the Joint Distribution Committee, and we organized a day of Indian Jewish culture that really featured the unique traditions of the Bnei Israel community in India. And here you can see in the way that they dress that they're deeply embedded in the local culture. And dress is, of course, just one example of this embeddedness. Matt, if you can move on to the next. And then another example of this is those beautiful photos from the wedding of Yemenite Jews in Israel. So this is a very recent pictures, and it also shows you the ways in which Jews in Israel today are honoring their diasporic past and their own unique culture, like religious and cultural traditions. And this is something, the question of how those traditions are being honored today in Israel is also a big question we can maybe cover in the Q&A. Okay, Matt, if you don't mind moving on to the next one. Okay, so going back to late antiquity, what I wanted to show you is already in the 5th century before the Common Era, you see the deep influence that Greek culture had on Jewish communities, both in Egypt and in the historical land of Israel. And one great example of this is this letter that was sent from Jerusalem to the city of Elephantine in Egypt, which was written in Aramaic and shows you those ongoing ties between different communities. And then in the next photo, what I want to show you is a bit later at the beginning of the Common Era, is this burial site, the necropolis at Bet Shearim, in which we found, so this dates back to the 2nd to the 4th century of the Common Era, where you see inscription in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So you can really see the influence of Greek culture spreading throughout the region and having a kind of enduring impact on Jews, not only in diaspora communities, but also in the land of Israel. Okay, I really want to wrap up the overview. So what I want to emphasize here is that after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, it's really Babylonia, so modern day Iraq, that emerged as the main spiritual and intellectual center of the Jewish world, and that this influence, the centrality of Babylonia as really the main center of Jewish life lasted for approximately 800 centuries, from the early 3rd century to the 11th century CE. So really, you can see that this played a major role in the development of Judaism and diaspora communities, because wherever they were in the world at the time, Jews continued to be in touch with the masters, with the religious masters in Babylonia, particularly through responsa, through questions that they asked to rabbis in Babylonia. But in the 11th century, you have the decline of Babylonia as this main center of Jewish life, and you see the shift away from Iraq to new centers of Jewish learning, primarily North Africa, Spain, and later Europe. And so really, it's in the early Middle Ages that you see the emergence of a distinct Ashkenazi and Sephardic culture. And we don't have time to go into the details of this, but really in the Middle Ages, you see communities emerging in Spain and the Rhineland, so north of France and Germany, that mark the beginning of really new distinct communities that speak different languages. So in the Rhineland region of France and Germany, people are speaking Yiddish, whereas in Spain, they adopt Arabic and Ladino, and you really see the emergence of distinct cultures, which is the cultures that we kind of recognize today. And Matt, if you could bring us to the next picture. Okay, so what's really interesting about the Middle Ages is that on the one hand, you have the emergence of distinct communities, but also ongoing interconnectedness in the Jewish world. And an excellent example of this is Benjamin of Tudela, who was a traveler, a Jewish traveler from Tudela in Spain, who traveled across the Jewish world from Europe through North Africa, the Far East, and even Asia. He actually writes about those Jewish communities in India, especially Cochin in southern India. And actually, what's not shown on the map is that he also visited Ashkenazi community in Northern Europe. And what really comes up in this travel log is one, the geographic spread of Jewish communities in the 12th, already in the 12th century, and you can see it on the map. Connected to this is, of course, the cultural diversity of Jews in the 12th century, but also, and he writes about this, the ways in which these various communities, despite becoming increasingly different from one another, nonetheless remained very connected across this vast geographic differences. Okay, so again, what I'm trying to show here is this goes back a long time in Jewish history. So to close the first part of the lecture, we see a big shift in starting in the 15th century, but it's a process that really ended by the middle of the 16th century, which is owing to persecutions both in Spain and in Northern Europe. Jews started migrating, and this is, I think, perhaps Jewish cultures that you're most familiar with today. Jews from Spain, of course, were expelled in 1492, and a few years later they were expelled from Portugal, and they migrated to a number of places. Matt, if you could move on to the next slide, please. So you can see the blue arrows here. You can see the migration of Jews from Iberia in the late 15th century. Some of them moved northwards towards southern France, for instance, but also many of them moved to the Ottoman Empire, and actually this is the place that received probably the most number of Iberian exiles, and also some of them moved to the New World, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. So you have what some scholars have called a double diaspora, right? Because you have the first diaspora, which is leaving the land of Israel, but also for Sephardic Jews, the exile from Iberia was an additional trauma that was carried across many generations, and a lot of Sephardic culture today really, and we'll talk about this too, goes back to carrying the memory of Spain and the experiences in the Iberian Peninsula. So here on the slideshow, I also brought you a picture of the Haggadah of Sarajevo in Bosnia, which is presumed to have been taken by some of those exiles. We don't know exactly who took it with them, but we know that this Haggadah, I think from the 14th century, was taken by some exiles eastward to the Ottoman lands and was eventually found in Bosnia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. So it's not only the migration of Jewish bodies, but also artifacts, and those artifacts really kept this memory alive for exiles. And there's actually a book by Geraldine Brooks that delves into also the more recent history of the Haggadah, but it's really quite fascinating. And so the other movement eastward that you see in that time period in the 15th, 16th century is the movement of Jews from the Rhineland region of France and Germany towards Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Lithuania. And this was definitely due to increasing persecution and the ways in which the status of Jews in Northern Europe had started to deteriorate in the 13th and especially in the 14th century. So you have this big shift forwards of Sephardic Jews towards Ottoman lands especially, and Ashkenazi Jews toward Eastern Europe. And again, that explains why today a lot of Ashkenazi Jews in the United States trace their roots to Eastern Europe. Okay, I'm going to stop here to talk about food. So Matt, if you could move on to the next slide, please. So I'm sure a lot of people recognize this dish. This is cholent, and cholent is the Ashkenazi name. And what I wanted to show is the ways in which Jews adapted to local cultures, but also developed what could be characterized as particularly distinct types of Jewish food. And so cholent is really fascinating because it shows you the diasporic journeys of Jews over time and their embeddedness into local cultures. So the long-standing origins of cholent are actually the Shabbat stew that was prepared already in the time of the Mishnah. And already in rabbinic Judaism, there was discussions about how to both honor the Shabbat and take pleasure on Shabbat day while observing the prohibition on cooking on Shabbat. And so rabbis already in the Talmud discussed the ways in which they could do this, and they determined that it was a good deed to have hot food on Shabbat. So Jews developed all kinds of strategies for doing this, including, and this was the case in Spain, burying the stew in a pit that they covered in hot ashes. And in other communities, the ways in which they kept this food hot that they had prepared on Friday, that they kept it hot all the way until Saturday, was to bring it to the communal oven and keep it on in the oven and then pick it up after services on Saturday. So what you see through this dish is how Jews who had to follow the commandment of observing the prohibitions on cooking on Shabbat developed specific ways of honoring that tradition. And so because of this, across the Jewish world, you see many different versions of cholent. They're not called cholent, of course, in other parts of the world, but it's the same idea, right? It's the idea that we need to eat hot food on Shabbat, but we also can't violate the Shabbat. And some food historians have actually ventured that this dish, the Shabbat stew, really took off in the 8th century in response to Karaite Jews who rejected the oral law and refused to keep any food warm for Shabbat. They saw this as actually a biblical prohibition. So the Shabbat stew in that context, emerged as a way for rabbinic Jews to differentiate themselves from Karaite Jews. And so what's really interesting about this dish is that depending on where Jews lived, they developed different names for it, and also the ingredients changed. So to give you just an example of this, in Spain, the name for cholent, for the Shabbat stew, was adafina, which comes from the Arabic covered. And another name that was also developed in Spain was jamin de trigo, hot dish of grains. And those names changed as Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. They took those names with them, but also adapted them. So because in Arabic lands, Arabic was spoken, Spanish Jews retain the Arabic name. And actually, if you go to France today, a lot of people still eat the dafina. The majority of Jews in France have roots in North Africa, and they call it daf, la daf, which is the French shortened version of adafina. So you can see how a term that goes back to Spain, medieval Spain, is still kept today in the context of French Jewish culture. And in Turkey, Jews who migrated from Spain to Turkey actually kept Ladino. And so the name that they kept there was jamin. But again, it's the same dish. It's the Shabbat stew. As far as Ashkenazim are concerned, you might wonder where the name cholent comes from. And historians have presumed that it's actually from French. It might date back to the 12th century. And it's from the French words chaud-lent, which means slow cooking. Okay, so you can see through this dish that Jews have adopted the name and ingredients of the dishes, but it's nonetheless a dish, despite its differences across cultures, that shows kind of the unity of the Jewish people in their observance of the Shabbat. Okay, next, I wanted to talk about magic and folk religion, because again, in magic, and especially in the very widespread use of amulets by Jews, over several centuries, you can see once again this interplay between cultural integration and kind of the certain unity of the Jewish world. So this is a gold amulet in Greek. It actually has the first verse of the Shema, and it was found in Hampton, Austria, and it dates back to the 3rd century. And it was found in a little case that was placed next to a child that had been buried. And here I think it's important to note that a lot of magical practices, especially the use of amulets, was really connected to rituals of childbirth and pregnancy, because of course, throughout most of history, infant mortality was quite high. Delivering babies was a very dangerous business. And so Jews, alongside non-Jews, developed all kinds of traditions to protect themselves from evil spirits and from, any dangerous things that could happen to them. And we know for a fact that the use of amulets was endorsed by the rabbis of the Mishnah. So it was allowed in Jewish history. It was allowed by the rabbinic Judaism. But what's really interesting is that as Jews moved across the world, they also developed their own unique protective devices and representations of those amulets. Matt, if you could move on to the next one, please. Okay, so as I said, the goal of those amulets were to protect the people who were using them from evil, but the amulets were used in many different ways. Some people wore them as jewelry. Some people wore them in their pockets, and we know that especially in Europe, they were printed on paper and they would be hung above doorways or on the walls. Okay, so those amulets were used in all kinds of different ways, but for the purpose of protecting the individual who was using them. So here on the left side of the slide of the picture, you can see actually a bracelet from Tunisia that shows you the ways in which those amulets were worn in North Africa. The amulets were also, especially when they were parchments or papers, they were rolled into small cases. So here you see this beautiful case from Morocco, which is not dated. Matt, could you move on to the next one, please? Okay, so here I brought you a few pictures of different amulets to show you both the unity and the diversity of those protective devices. So what separates them, and you can see, I think, quite well in the pictures, is the materials that were used to produce those amulets. You can see it here that the ones from Morocco and Iran use silver. So silver and gold were very much used to produce amulets in Islamic lands. But the ones from Italy and Frankfurt are paper, right? So you can see here the differences between them, but there's also a lot that unites them. And of course, there's a use of Hebrew and Aramaic. Usually you can see both languages on those amulets. And also, while Jews kind of adopted the local imagery of the cultures where they lived, there were also some overlapping imagery and tropes across vast distances through these amulets. Matt, could you move on to the next one, please? Okay, so here in this amulet, you can see the Kabbalistic hand at the bottom of the amulet, and the eagle here that I want to show you in the next slide. And this imagery, you can see both east and west, right? So that's what's really interesting about those amulets, is that despite differences in style and actual material object, the text and designs are often similar across vast distances. And here I want to show you one that I'm especially in love with, which is one from India. So bringing us back to India. Matt, if you can move on to the next one, please. Okay, and here I want to give you maybe a few seconds to take that one in. So this was, as I said, a lot of those amulets were made to protect women when they were carrying babies and delivering babies, and also newborn children. And so this particular amulet, like many of them, was used for the protection of pregnant women and newborn children. And it's from Kochi in India, dating back to the 18th or 19th century. And what's really interesting is that we actually see the phone marks So it's ink on vellum. And if you see the actual physical objects, you can see the creases, which shows that this was a document that was folded up and carried by individuals who were trying to protect themselves from evil spirits. Matt, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay. So here, what I wanted to show you on the slides is the fact that in India, as I alluded to earlier, there were multiple communities that came from different parts of the Jewish world. And developed very distinct cultures and identities. And one of those groups was based in Kochi today, in southern India. You can see it on the map at the very top of India. You see the town of Kochi. What's really interesting about Kochi is that it's a very small city, and today you can actually still go and see the synagogues. There are multiple synagogues. But Kochi actually attracted different groups of Jews. One of them was the Malabari Jews, who came in ancient times and are considered like an indigenous local community. And later on, Kochi attracted Jewish exiles from Spain and Portugal. And they were called the Paradesis, the foreigners. And the Paradesis of Kochi retained Judeo-Spanish until pretty recent times. So what's really interesting, and this, again, Matt, if you could move on to the next slide, we're going to go back to the amulet. Here in the amulet, you can actually see some Judeo-Spanish. So again, we're talking about a population that left the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th or 16th century, became traders on the Indian subcontinent, but kept Judeo-Spanish. So here you can see again the interplay between the multiple influences that that shaped Jews across their migrations, because here you have Hebrew and Aramaic tying this particular community to other communities in the world, but also the Jews of Judeo-Spanish. So here you can see the Judeo-Spanish were canlar candelas, which might refer to the candle lighting ritual. Maybe the candle lighting ritual was seen as protective of pregnant women and newborns. Here also, some historians have posited that the bird of prey that you see on this amulet was actually Lilith. And again, Lilith is a theme that unites Jews all over the world in their use of amulets, because there was this notion that Lilith, who was seen as the first wife of Adam, was intent on harming Jewish children. But that if you use the names of 3 different angels in the amulet, you would protect the children from her evil intents, right? So in a lot of amulets, again, both East and West, you see Lilith on those amulets. So right under the bird of prey, you can see it's probably the chair of Elijah, which is used in the circumcision ritual. But especially in Eastern communities, the chair of Elijah was used in the birthing room. So in a place like Iraq in particular, Jewish communities would place a chair of Elijah in the birthing room, and on it they would place one of those amulets, again to protect the birthing woman and her newborn. Okay, so here you can really see that across time and space, the imagery of Lilith and the different strategies that were used to protect from her harmful actions united Jews all over the world. And this is true of amulets again in Germany, Italy, North Africa, etc. A lot of the quotations that were used on those amulets were biblical quotations. So on this particular amulet, you can find the excerpts from the Book of Psalms, the priestly blessing, Song of Song, Proverbs. Okay, so it's really taking from so many different Jewish textual sources, but also later sources, particularly Kabbalistic sources. So the names of angels, for instance, mystical texts that traveled through the Jewish world. Matt, if you could move on to the next one, please. Okay, so this is another amulet from India. This is a Baghdadi amulet. I talked earlier about Baghdadi Jewish traders. And this one was painted Hebrew, and it was dedicated to members of the very influential Sassoon family, who were traders originally from Iraq, who made their way to India and Southeast Asia and are considered the Rothschilds of the East. So if you've ever lived or visited this region, everyone will know the name Sassoon. So also a beautiful artifact from India. Okay, I want to make one last point about Jewish amulets. Matt, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so what's really interesting about amulets is on the one hand, they reflected, Jews' attachment to Jewish text and mystical traditions, but they were through the magic and folk religion. You can see also forms of, and actually pretty deep forms of interaction between Jewish culture and the surrounding cultures. And one example of this is Yemen. And here I brought a picture from a script for a love spell amulet that dates back to the 19th century, but the occult magical tradition played a very important role in Yemenite Jewish communities going back centuries. It was not a new phenomenon in the 19th century. So this, you can see Judeo-Arabic on this script. And what's really interesting about the case of Yemen is that often Jews drew on Muslim text. And so in some of those amulets from 19th century Yemen, you can see references to Muhammad or Jesus. Even though they didn't know who Jesus was, there was really no context for understanding him as a historical figure. But what it shows us is that Jews copied from other manuscripts that were not produced by Jews. And the other side of the coin is that we also know in the Yemenite context that Jews were they were Jewish healers. They were consulted not only by members of their own community, but also by Muslims who thought that, they could also be protected by the specific healing powers of those those writers of amulets. So, and this is interesting in Yemen because in Yemen there was segregation, there was a separation between Jews and Muslims, but nonetheless, in this Jewish folk traditions, you can really see those communities coming together and learning from each other. Okay, we're nearing the end of the lecture, so I want to move on to music. And my hope here had been to listen together to 3 different excerpts of the Piyut, the liturgical poem, Derorikra. Matt, if you could move to the, okay. So Derorikra was composed in the 10th century in Spain by Dunash Ben Labrat. And Ben Labrat is really fascinating because he really exemplifies those medieval Jewish migrations. He was born in Fez, Morocco, moved to Cordoba, and then, he moved to Baghdad, actually, born in Fez, moved to Baghdad, where he learned under Sadia Gaon, who was one of the main chachamim of Jewish history, main sages, and then moved to Spain, to Cordoba, where he wrote this liturgical poem, which is sung to this days. And I'm happy to share the PowerPoint later if you want to look at the poem closer. But what's really interesting is that today the poem is still sung, but to very different melodies. And so that's what I wanted to end the lecture with. So how should we do this? Matt, are you able to connect us to, so on the next slide, you can see the link to the Derorikra.
Yeah, I'm going to
okay, so just as Matt is setting it up, so we're going to listen to 3 different versions of Derorikra. One is the Western Sephardic version, and I will talk about Western Sephardic in a second. The second one is the Moroccan version, and the third one is an Indian version that's a Baghdadi, so it came from Baghdad, but was sung in Bombay in the 1930s. And what I really want, I want you to kind of close your eyes and listen to those different versions and to immerse yourself really in the melodies. Thank you, Matt. Let's move on to the Moroccan version. And it's played by on the right floor.
Sounds like something.
you don't have the right auto coverage,
Or at least I'm ahead on
like blow
YouTube.
your
It's the other, it was the other slide, sorry. Okay.
And then the third version is the one I was mentioning from Bombay in the 1930s. I'll go back down. Actually, so this is really interesting. Actually, if you don't mind pausing for a second, this is this beautiful album, Shir Odu, which was really record. It was made by an ethnomusicologist. I think she's based in London, and she's of Baghdadi descent. And she found or collaborated with someone who found all those recordings from the 1930s and put them together into this album. And what's really interesting is in this album, you actually have 3 different versions of Derorikra, and quite distinct versions, which shows you again how in the context of India itself, they were very much distinct communities that on the one hand, exchanged with one another, but also retained distinctive traits. So the version I wanted to listen to from this album is this one, yeah, Abid David's version.
I'm not logged in at the moment, actually. I thought maybe it would play. Do you?
Okay, can I try?
Yeah.
Let me try to play it on. If I can share, can I share my screen again? We'll try that.
Yeah, I'm going to stop my share.
I apologize to everyone about the logistical issues, but I think it's worth a listen. Okay, share sounds. Okay. Can you never Matt?
Yeah, it's good.
Yes, okay. Okay, I will stop here for the sake of time, but I highly encourage everyone to listen to it in the confines of their home because it's just gorgeous. I have to say that my personal favorite is the Moroccan version, which I used to sing when I was growing up So again, it talks about the ways in which we carry melodies with us. And that's really by talking about food and music and magic. I wanted to show you the many different ways in which Jewish culture, and in all its diverse forms, is embodied and carried from within, and also carried by non-elites, carried by women, right? Because often when we talk about Jewish history, we're focusing on rabbis, we're focusing on thinkers and theologians, but we see throughout the Jewish diaspora that those traditions were carried on by the folk, by the small people, by people who were not recognized. So that was my hope here. So I want to talk a little bit about those three versions that you heard. The first one was the Western Sephardic version. And this is really interesting because it's quite different from the others. And it's because Western Sephardim are also called Spanish Portuguese Jews. In New York, you have the Portuguese Jewish, Spanish Portuguese synagogue, where Jews who had been whose families had been forcibly converted to Christianity before the Inquisition and remained in Spain and Portugal until, as Christians, but later on, especially in the 17th century, moved to parts of the world where they could reclaim their Jewish identity. So for instance, in the context of France, the Jewish community of Bordeaux in southwestern France was one of those communities that was founded by those former new Christians who returned to Judaism. And that's why the liturgy is quite different from the other versions that you've heard, because they lost Jewish liturgy by virtue of being formerly Christians in Spain. So the influences there musically are very different. They were very influenced by Baroque music, by pretty much the European musical styles that were in vogue at the time. But they also received the other influences, particularly Italian influences, because there were also communities of new Christians in Italy that were connected to more like older Jewish communities. So on the one hand, you have Baroque music, you also have Italian influences, and then you also have the fact that starting in Amsterdam in the 17th century, there were cantors, particularly from Salonika and Morocco, so people who had an uninterrupted musical chain of Jewish music, who came to Amsterdam as cantors to those communities. So it's a lot of Baroque music, but also somewhat inflected by Ottoman and North African influences, right? So here, Matt, if you don't mind showing us the slide again. I had brought two portraits that kind of highlights the ways in which those former new Christians, those Spanish Portuguese Jews, were influenced by Christian culture. So those are some of my favorite Jewish portraits. It's the Loeb portrait collection of early American Jews. Oh, well, not this one, actually, the next one. This one is from Don Francisco Lopez Suazo in the 17th century, but I want to show you the next one particularly, because a lot of people don't know those portraits, but they're actually quite fascinating. So those were Spanish Portuguese Jews who had made their way to the Americas in the 18th century. So Moses Raphael Levy lived actually when the United States of America did not yet exist, but Clara de la Motte was here painted in the late 18th century. But you can really see here the influence of European culture on those Spanish Portuguese Jews. Okay, the next version was the Moroccan version that we heard, which shows once again how Jews who migrated from the Iberian Peninsula to Morocco took their instruments with them and their melodies, because we know already when Dounache Ben Labrade composed the Piyut de l'Arikha, it was played with the oud, it was played by percussions, and a lot of those instruments moved along in the migration. And to this day, this musical heritage is being kept alive actually in Israel, especially, where you have the Andalusian ensemble. This is not the word, I think it's called the Andalusian Orchestra, which plays this music that has roots in the Iberian Peninsula. And then the third example is the example of Baghdadi Jewish music, which of course is very influenced by Arabic melodic modes. So Jews, especially in Iraq and Syria, were very influenced by what's called the makamat, which is Arabic melodic modes that you can really hear in the song. And the singer Habib David was actually born in Baghdad, and he took those traditions with him to Bombay, where he settled in 1915. And now this brings me to my last point, and this is really a call for learning more about Jewish diaspora cultures. What's so interesting in the context of 1930s Bombay is that other Jewish communities there, with no ties to this music, also learned from this music. So through the encounters between Baghdadi Jews and the Bnei Israel community, this heritage also became shared more globally by Indian Jews despite their ethnic differences. And I was mentioning Sarah Menasseh, this ethnomusicologist. She interviewed a member of this Bnei Israel community. I think she interviewed him in 2001. And she asked him about his musical influences. And here's what he said. Musically, we learned it. So we learned religious practice and song, mainly from the Jews from Cochin, Yemen, or Iraq. In quite a lot of our families, we used to sing them very often. When I was a young child, we used to have to sing them every evening before supper, 7, 8 children standing in a line while mother is serving supper, and we used to have to sing 3 of them at least every evening before you got served, Sunday to Thursday. As far as I can remember, it would be more Marathi than Hebrew. So Marathi is it's the local language of Maharashtra in southern India. And here again, you can see the influences, both the influences from other Jewish communities and influences from the local culture. And I want to end with this slide to really show you that for all of Jewish history, Jews have learned from each other and benefited and been enriched by each other's very distinct local Jewish cultures. And I really hope that we continue to do this in our time. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for such an engaging presentation. You got so much wonderful information in with so many beautiful pictures. So I appreciate it. I see questions have come in and still coming in. So feel free, those of you, to send us more questions. The questions really run through a lot of the different aspects of history you brought up. So I see a few here going back to
and I'm sorry if I had to rush through it, and I apologize. I have a tendency to speak fast, so I apologize for those who had perhaps some hard time following
yeah.
the
No,
lecture.
and also it's recorded, so anybody out there you can feel free to go back and watch any parts. There's a few questions about looks like they're about essentially they're about the 10 lost tribes and why why certain diaspora Jews, like we're going all the way back to the biblical period here, maintained a connection and others lost the connection. So I guess between the Babylonian exile and maybe in the Jews of during the Assyrian exile, trying to put a few questions together there. Do you have more to say about that?
Yes. So the questions, and the further we move away from the present times, the more difficult it is for me to answer questions because I'm a modern Jewish historian. But what interests me about the concept of the lost tribes is the ways in which the idea of the lost tribes has endured until this day. To me, that's the very interesting things, right? It's the ways in which communities all over the world, and again, that's true today, have turned to ancient history to claim Jewish ancestry. And so I did not talk about the Bnei Menashe in India, but there is another community in India, which is located in the northern part of India, which claims, and again, I'm not saying it's not necessarily true, but they claim that they're descendants of the lost tribes, and they've actually, some of them have formally converted to Israel and made Aliyah. So what really interests me is the way in which this idea is mobilized for Jews to either build connection to other communities that were not traditionally seen as Jewish, and also by communities that are not necessarily recognized as Jewish, to show that they have some claims to this shared heritage. And the idea of the lost tribes, I mean, it's something that has fascinated not only Jews, but also European Christians, in the 16th century. So I think there's a whole history not only about what happened to those 10 tribes, and actually we don't know that much about it as far as I can tell, but the ways in which people have remained fascinated through the centuries by what happened to those lost tribes. So that's what I would say. Then you had a question about, why is it that some people, if I understood the questions correctly, lost contact to the Jewish world. So I showed in the lecture that communities remained connected. A lot of communities did remain connected, and we didn't have time to really delve into it, but this has to do with literacy, right? A lot of Jews could read and write. Jews in most communities retained Hebrew as the sacred language. So they used vernacular languages, right? Jews spoke Jewish variants of local languages, Judeo, Spanish, or Yiddish, or Judeo-Arabic. And those vernacular very much sounded like they were very similar to the local vernaculars, but they were written in Hebrew script, right? So the script was kept. And Hebrew as a language of prayer and communication with other communities was also kept. And this allowed communities to stay connected, right? So you have those religious ties through responsa, family ties, because people migrated, but often, so like the Sassoon family, for instance, they migrated across vast distances, but they remained in touch, right? And so that also allowed for those communities to remain connected. And then one thing we didn't talk about, but of course we could spend an hour on this, is the role of trade, right? So like, for instance, in Europe, Jews ended up in the Roman Empire both as freed slaves, but also as traders. Again, you have this interplay between involuntary migration and voluntary migration. And trade allowed these communities to stay connected. People are moving from one place to place. They're exchanging goods with one another, et cetera, right? So this brings us to your question of why is it nonetheless that some communities were not able to maintain this? And I think one example of this is the Jews of China. And I will talk about this in September. But I think this has to do with demography, right? When communities become too scattered, it's just like part of the reason why in the late 1700s, Ashkenazi Jews were their largest community, is that they weren't as dispersed as Sephardic communities. So it's just easier. And of course, you have population growth in that time period. But I think it has to do with demography and also with the quote unquote geopolitical economic conditions. So in China, we know that Jews in China, their synagogue was destroyed numerous times because of the Yellow Sea overflowing. There was a lot of upheavals having to do with kind of the broader Chinese context, right? So I think we have to look beyond Jewish history to understand how certain communities have declined over time and lost. And I think when Jews, due to those variety of factors, lost touch with other communities, I think that really accelerated the decline of communities like the Jewish Chinese community, Chinese Jewish community.
Thank you. There's many questions that people are really interested in the amulets, and so I want to sort of jump to that. And there's one by Professor Lauren Strauss, who I know you are friends with. So I think it summarizes a lot of the questions well, although she has a number of questions built in. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. As always, I wonder about the rabbinic reception of folk traditions, especially ones involving magic. There are many religious prohibitions on necromancy and other forms of magic. So how did amulets and such become so popular? Did the folk, especially the women, simply ignore rabbinic prohibitions? Did the rabbis just accept the fact that living in the diaspora, Jews would absorb some practices from their surroundings?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. So I think the first thing is I said, and that's why I started with this, that originally the rabbinic tradition, the early rabbinic tradition endorsed amulets, right? So there was no outward prohibition on having amulets. However, and Lauren is right to point this out, over time, as the use of amulets took on different forms in multiple Jewish places, like Jewish communities, there was some pushback by some rabbis. I would say the pushback was never uniform on the part of rabbis, but there were some rabbinic authorities who kind of rejected some of the superstitious practice of the common people. But I think, as Loan rightly pointed out, that one, this opposition was never uniform enough to really prevent Jews for continuing those practices. And also, I think absolutely, there's halacha, there's minhagim, there's customs, there's what the rabbis are saying, and we see this today too. There's what the people do, right? And this, amulets, we're talking about matters of life and death. I think, having birthed children, women will do whatever they can to protect themselves from giving birth, from the horrible things that can happen to them, and protecting their babies. And I think that explained why, even in the face of some criticism, those practices really remained over time and were preserved.
Thank you. And there's a couple of more specific questions. One was just how big were the amulets, and what were they written on?
Okay. So there are all kinds of material. As I said, in Europe, they tended to be on paper. So the one from Frankfurt is on paper. But in Islamic lands, so in Iraq or North Africa, there was first a lot of Jews were really versed in the art of jewelry making. And so they used the skills that they had to produce those protective objects. So a lot of North African or Iraqi amulets are made of silver, for instance. So here they really drew on their own skills that they had. So in terms of material, it really depended on the community, and they came in different sizes. But the whole point of the amulet is that it's largely a portable object, right? So however big it was still something that could be either, so if it was paper, it could be folded and carried, say, in a pocket. Or if it's jewelry, then it's something that you could wear on yourself, on around your neck or around your wrist, or that you could carry in a case, right? So the portability, I think, of the material object is also what ensured its persistence over the centuries.
And as also as a follow-up, does the evil eye that is all this, I'm quoting what this person wrote here, does the evil eye that is all over Turkey hold any significance in Judaism?
Yes. So again, this goes back to what I was saying about it's not just being influenced, but it's also making the local traditions really yours, right? Judaizing tropes in the surrounding culture, right? So the evil eye is one of them. But in Islamic lands, you had the hand, the khamsa, which was, again, it did not emerge out of Jewish culture, but it was definitely absorbed by Jewish cultures, and the fish. As far as I know, this is not a symbol that you see in Ashkenazi amulets, but it's a very common symbol throughout the Arabic-speaking Sephardic world, which again, the fish and the khamsa were symbols from the surrounding culture that were quote unquote Judaized, that really became Jewish symbols for those communities. Actually, on the topic of the fish, I don't know if anyone is planning a trip to Singapore, but if you do be in touch. If you go to this gorgeous museum here, it's called the Museum of Asian Civilizations. There is a very small display in that museum of Baghdadi Jewish artifacts. And one of them is a Havdalah flask in the form of a fish made of gold. So this is, again, one example of how the fish became kind of a staple of the imagery used in those communities.
Yeah, wonderful. There's another question here, and I'll try to summarize it. It's a little long, but somebody's asking about how Jews in different places look like. I mean, the physical similarities to the population there, and if you have more to say about intermarriage or different relations that would have happened, and whether or not that's been studied.
Yes, so there's a lot of interest in this, and this is part of why I actually brought those pictures in the PowerPoint. And I have actually, when I was a colleague of Lauren's at American University, I taught the history of the Jewish diaspora, and I always start with those pictures because I think it makes students realize that they've internalized a certain way of looking Jewish, and that this way is not, this is one way that Jews look, but there are all kinds of Jews, and that has been the case throughout history. It's not just a modern phenomenon. So yes, you can see from the pictures that clearly people probably intermarried with some local communities. But what's really interesting is that now there's an increasing turn to genetic history to kind of understand the migrations. And I am not an expert on this, but there is literature on this. There's both, I think, popular literature and I think more serious academic scholarship that kind of tries to use DNA testing to trace those migrations, and that answers some of those questions, and that shows, in which parts of the world there was maybe more intermarriage, but also the ways in which Jews remain distinct communities despite their migration and integrating into local communities. I'm not an expert on this, but I know there's literature on this that does kind of answer some of these questions through the day. I mean, I would be cautious to use this as an example, but I would say, for sure there was also intermarriage. And actually, my current project looks at a Baghdadi Jew here in Singapore who married, unbeknownst to his Baghdadi Jewish family, a Chinese woman. And again, this is a community where technically intermarriage was really frowned upon. So, I think Jews are very reluctant to talk about intermarriage because it seems there are historical reasons for this, but it's seen as a kind of a threat to Jewish distinctiveness or identity. But yeah, throughout history, there have been some instances of intermarriage, of course.
Yeah, definitely. A question here. You mentioned you talked a lot about connections between communities. Were there times where there were tensions, or examples maybe you want to share of tensions between some of the communities?
So join me in September.
Oh, okay.
Because in September, I want to talk about this. This lecture was a positive spin on Jewish history, connectedness, etc. But what I want to show when we talk about Asian Jews is how in those locales, and especially in India, for instance, or Burma, those different Jewish communities, had somewhat also tense. There was exchanges, intellectual and culture and other, but also lots of tension. And I'm also interested in, we'll explore this in September, in the ways in which communities that had largely lost their distinctiveness, such as the Chinese community of Kaifeng, Chinese Jewish community of Kaifeng, were rediscovered both by European Christians and by other Jewish communities, and were re-Judaized. And that's also true of the Bnei Israel community of India, which was very separate from the rest of the Jewish world. They're like the Judaism of the Bnei Israel community historically was not rooted in rabbinic Judaism. But this community was discovered in the 18th, especially 19th century, by Cochin Jews and Baghdadi Jews, and learned another form of Judaism. And so this is a topic unto itself that I really want to explore at length when we have those three-part series.
Yeah, wonderful. We'll definitely save that for the next sessions. And another question here: Does prayer liturgy for the longing to return to Jerusalem and Israel vary significantly between different communities, or if you want to say anything more about?
Okay, I'm not an expert on this, but as far as I understand, I don't think that's the case. And actually, that is a commonality across all those different traditions, I think. That this is something that really unites Jewish communities historically.
Yeah. This is another one that's more historical in nature. Somebody asked about the Bar Kokhba revolt and the displacement of Jews during that time, and if you have anything to say about that.
I mean, what I would say is, like, during this time, again, like, this is the time of the Roman expansion, events like the Bar Kokhba revolt for sure influenced like the migration patterns of Jews. And again, to go back to the Roman Empire, what you see playing out in that period is both forced migration, for instance, as a result of persecution under the Romans, but also individuals moving within the confines of the Roman Empire to trade and find greater freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a good example of how persecutions have always been one factor among many other factors of why Jews have ended up in the places where they eventually settled.
Yeah. As we come to a conclusion tonight, I'll ask this one question, and you can take that as your final question, or if there's something you want to leave us with that's different, both would be wonderful. But just the question is, are there any lessons that we can draw from diversity of Jewish traditions in confronting modern challenges around assimilation and cultural loss?
I mean, the first one, and that goes back to the point I was making earlier about acknowledging that we live in difficult times. This is my personal belief that we're stronger as Jews if we um, express solidarity with one another and are willing to learn from our differences, culture and other. So I think we can learn this from the diaspora. And the second thing really is the fluidity of boundaries and identities, right? You see this in so many aspects of the presentation I gave today, in which identities shift, they evolve, and Jews are an excellent example of how their identities evolve, but they also remain connected to the things that matter, right? And so I think that in a time of increasing, nationalism, attempts to close borders, et cetera, and here I'm not making a political statement. What I'm trying to say is we live in a new geopolitical reality in which I think people's identities, group identities, feel threatened. And my hope is that we don't feel threatened by those fluid boundaries, but really enriched and inspired.
Wonderful. I think that's a beautiful note to end on in our complicated world today. There's so much that we can learn from our own tradition among many others. So I appreciate it. And as a final mini question, a few people have asked about if they can send you any emails. I don't know if there's an email
Yes.
address or
So
way
I always forget to do this. I was going to prepare a
Ah,
slide with my email, which I failed to. So Matt, feel free to send an email with my email address, and people should feel free to reach out. And for those who reach out, or if you even want to do this and send it to everyone, I'm very happy to share their PowerPoint because we covered a lot of ground. So if anyone wants to have access to those pictures, so I can share the PowerPoint, and I'm happy also to share bibliographical references because I drew on the work of a lot of colleagues, a lot of scholars. So, if anyone wants to dig into any aspect of the lecture, I'm always happy to share my references with you.
wonderful. Thank you. Well, I guess but my lights went out just behind me, so that's
It's
fine.
time. It's
Um,
time.
I just have the bright one in front of me. Sorry about that. So thank you again for sharing your wonderful expertise with us and tackling these questions. And looking forward so much to learning with you again in September. And I'm sure many of you all out there are looking forward to do the same. So thank you again and have
I
a
appreciate
wonderful,
everyone joining. Yeah, I'm really glad we could share this moment together. So thank you for joining.
yeah, great. Have a good rest of your day and good night, everyone.